My next guest is a friend of the show. She's a friend of mine, and she's a friend of ufology in general. And she's somebody that you should absolutely be following. And if you're not already, you will be by the end of this conversation. I'm talking, of course, about the amazing Kelly Chase. She's a rising voice in ufology. She is the host and creator of the amazing UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. She is also the writer and executive producer of the new docuseries Cosmosis, UFOs and a New Reality, which drops on Apple TV on December 30th. She's also the monthly guest host on the long-running Dreamland podcast, created by the legendary Art Bell and currently helmed by Whitley Strieber. Kelly is a published author and speaker on the intersection of science, spirituality, and the unexplained. She has been featured on shows such as Beyond UFOs and the Unknown and UFO Revolution, and has frequently offered her expertise on UFO topics for News Nation. We sat down, we had a great conversation. We talked about everything. We talked about the state of play in the disclosure discussion. We talked about ufology in general. We talked about the recent congressional hearings and the news with the drones and everything that's going on. She has a great perspective on all of this, a lot to add to the discussion. I know you're going to enjoy it. Please, if you're not already a subscriber, consider subscribing. It only takes a second. It doesn't cost a dime, and it really does help the channel. It's a heavy lift to build this channel from scratch, and we need all the help we can get. Don't forget to like and share this video as well. Now let's get to the conversation. But before we do, let's take a quick look at the trailer for Cosmosis, UFOs, and a New Reality.
What I saw that night, I can never forget it.
There was a connected feeling as if it could read my mind. So I waved up at it.
I just remember after that experience, I felt like my life was supposed to be lived a certain way, that effectively I was given a second chance.
People don't just experience it in flight. There are other experiences that they're not even reporting.
There is an extraordinary conversation going on about UFOs and technology and weapons, but not the experience, not the actual experience of being face to face with this.
I think when somebody sees a UFO or has an experience of one, it kind of forces you to confront what your belief systems are, how you feel about things, how you feel about other people, your place in the world, and how big or small it is.
A lot of the stigma that surrounds this subject has to do with the manufactured campaign, an institutionalized campaign to keep people from talking about it, especially scientists.
If you're confused and you're lost, it's because the people who do this are great at their jobs. They've been perfecting this for decades. They're not craftsmen of disinformation. They're artists.
The fact that we're not alone in the universe, it's paradigm shifting. It's huge. It could be the biggest story in human history. So why aren't more people talking about this?
We don't need to wait around for the government to give us the answers. The UFO phenomenon is a part of our reality. It's not something that the government can lock up in an underground bunker somewhere and keep from us. It's everywhere, and it's happening all the time.
If you look at the history of humans, you're going to see that it's a history of engagement with non-human intelligence, because a lot of people believe in non-human intelligence.
I think it's very difficult to talk about the strange stuff, precisely because it's so strange.
We're living in a little corner of the world, just a little corner that we call reality. We need to turn off the lights, open the door, and walk out of this little house we live in, and then we're going to start to see something real.
Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time to catch up with me. It's been a while.
Hey, Clint, it's so great to see you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the last conversation we had, so I've been looking forward to this.
It's great to be back with you, and I feel like the whole world has changed so much in just the few months that have passed since we last spoke. And I wanted to circle back and get a 30,000-foot view from you of where your head's at with everything that's going on and then talk about your new project, Cosmosis, and find out what else you're working on.
That sounds
Does that work
great.
for
Let's
you?
do it. Yeah.
What is the state of play right now? And I know this is a huge question, but if anyone can answer it, you are in the perfect position to answer it. What is the situation right now in terms of disclosure, in terms of the phenomenon, in terms of public awareness and understanding of what's going on? We've got so much going on in the news. There's been new congressional hearings. There's all these drone sightings happening all over the world. It seems like we're having a moment right now. Speak to that a little bit and give us some atmospherics on sort of where we're at as of today.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, things really have changed since I think it was like April maybe that we talked. I will be very honest and say that in a lot of ways, I feel less certain than ever about what's going on, particularly with the narrative as far as regards to disclosure. It seems like all of that has gotten increasingly weird and muddied. And when you pair that with the fact that, so we just had our second round of, well, third or fourth, if you count the ones in the Senate, of hearings about UFOs. And like you said, we have this flap going on. So on like one level, disclosure is kind of moving the ball down the field in a way that I think a lot of the community has really been excited about, in that more and more people are talking about this, not nearly at the extent that we would like, but in terms of where we are in terms of public awareness, huge advances have been made. But I think what's interesting to see now that that's happening is how that in some ways creates its own hall of mirrors. You know, like using this example of the kind of drone flap that's going on, particularly in New Jersey, but around the world. And it's happening over military bases, and it's happening over, you know, very busy, well-populated residential areas. And on top of kind of all of the secrecy and disinfo around whatever this is, it seems like a lot of it is probably man-made tech, although some things like orbs that have been reported over bases might be more anomalous. It's really hard to tell. But, you know, you see people posting all of these videos, and you'd think that this was going to make things like more clear for us. Like, we're having this like awakening and something's about to happen. But what's really happening is that we're losing the signal in the noise. It's really unclear what's going on. The government isn't talking about it. They won't tell us what's going on. And then on top of, so you have these drones reported, and then all of a sudden you have all of these private people who have their own drones, you know what I mean? That they're non-commercial drones that they're putting up there. There's probably some tech that our military has that we don't know about. That's probably up there. And so, but then on top of that, you have just a bunch of people who are just clocking into this conversation for the first time and don't really know what certain, you know, don't know what a helicopter looks like, apparently. You know, you can hear the blades, you can see the lights. It's clearly a helicopter. And they're like, look how low this drone is flying. And like, it's not a drone. So the conversation, I think, is just getting really, really muddied. And I think we could see that in the hearings too. We can go into that if you want to. But I think like in terms of the state of play, I think that there's sort of the signal's getting lost by dilution in a way, because now there's so many people talking about it that it's kind of hard to follow the various threads.
You mentioned the congressional hearings that have been going on, and there seems to be some mixed reviews, I guess is probably the best way to put it, as to whether or not those are actually getting us closer to or further away from something resembling an official disclosure. What's your take on what you've seen so far, and how is Congress handling all of this?
I mean, I'll say that I'm encouraged by the fact that Congress seems more clocked in than they've ever been, and that some of them, like Nancy Mace, came all guns blazing, and, you know, they're becoming seen enough, apparently, to feel like there's something real going on here. And yet, they don't know what it is. And so they're supposed to be providing oversight over the spending, but they're not. They also are being told that they don't have the clearance to even know what's going on. And so I think that, you know, that's good to see that they're at least waking up to it. I think what the hearings did was really kind of, to me at least, I feel like I could see the shape of the problem better than ever. Part of it is that, like, yes, technically we want our elected officials to be able to have access to this information, but because of our classification system, they don't have access to this information. And so even when they do things like pulling in these witnesses for hearings, those people can't actually tell them anything. And so then you have some like civilians that you bring in, you know, you've got reporters like Michael Schellenberger, but they can't really tell you anything either, because they're also protecting sources who also have classifications and NDAs that they've signed. And so, like, I don't know how we move the ball forward from that place. Like, if David Grush was there 18 months ago telling them about crash retrieval programs and biologics and all of that, and they still haven't been able to move the ball forward with that information, like, I know that people like Jeremy Corbell were really excited about that Immaculate Constellation document. But as far as I'm concerned, that document gives us nothing. It gives them nothing to go on. It's unfounded information, and Michael Schellenberger and Jeremy Corbell are protecting their sources, as I think we can argue journalists should. But like, it could be real, it could be a fan fiction. Like, we don't know what that is, and our elected officials, if they aren't able to have access to who those sources are, and those sources aren't willing to talk to Congress, then like, what have we accomplished by giving them this document? I would argue we've accomplished nothing.
It does seem like it's a hall of mirrors, doesn't it? Like there's just every question that gets answered, there's just 10 more questions behind it. And it almost seems like it's so frustratingly overclassified that no one seems to know what anyone else is doing, up to and including the president. And it's like they have all these different programs and no one is cleared to actually understand all. I wonder if do you think at the top of this, whatever this group is that seems to be in charge, is there one person who has a full complete picture, do you think, or a group of people that have a complete picture of what's actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's almost certainly a group of people who have a clear idea of what is happening. It's probably a very small, tightly held group, and probably we don't know their names. It's probably, I think that, this kind of constellation of people around this subject, that's the forward facing part of this. And you don't have people who are involved in these deep, deep black projects that are completely unaccounted for. And apparently there's no oversight whatsoever. Like, they're not doing interviews on podcasts. Like, they don't write books. And so we don't know who those people are. A certain amount of them, and maybe even most of them, probably aren't even technically working for our government. They're probably contractors of some kind who actually aren't really working for the DoD, which is a really scary place to be in when you think about it, because in a way, like, our country has been hijacked by a very small group of people. We don't know who they are. They have they have a functionally limitless budget, and people have at least accused them of having access to completely asymmetrical paradigm shifting technology. And so I don't think we're going to know who those people are. And I don't know the answer to, like, how do you realistically call a group of people like that to heal? I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Congress has the ability to do that. And I'm going to be honest. I don't know that the president has the ability to do that.
So is it fair to characterize this group as sort of a quasi-government, quasi-private, sort of gray area group of people who sort of have all the benefits and access to government technology, funding, and information, but none of the responsibilities or oversight that would come with that you would expect to?
Yeah, I think that that's probably what we're dealing with here. I think that what we're seeing is kind of the natural conclusion of what Eisenhower warned us about with, beware the military industrial complex. Because as soon as we started this kind of siloing of information with top secret tech, especially, after World War II and going into the Cold War, although, even like, we could argue it started before then, like, we created this problem, and we haven't found a good way to fix it. And I don't mean to be doom and gloom about it, but like, I'm trying to think of like really, what do you do in this situation? And I don't know that, I have a lot of friends who are working in disclosure, who are in Washington all the time, who are talking to representatives, who are trying to move the ball down the field. And I have nothing but respect for what they're doing. But I feel like realistically, I'm not sure that we can get there from here.
Yeah, it's like, if we can't even get the Pentagon to pass an audit, then how do you, it's like, that would be the first step, wouldn't it? To just sort of audit them.
Yeah, exactly. If there's trillions of dollars that are being unaccounted for, and then where are these trillions of dollars going? And what have they been able to do with these trillions of dollars over decades? Potentially, we're being told, with access to technology that if they were able to reverse engineer it even a little bit, would have given them a significant advantage. Like, it's kind of scary to think about what we're actually up against here. And it's strange to me that people don't talk about. You don't hear people talk about that. It's everybody's trying to push for, like, we're fighting this like hand-to-hand combat, like every single, trying to move this ball forward, and just for one line to end up in a piece of legislation somewhere that's going to get us like marginally closer to transparency. And like as noble as that is, I don't know. I have a lot of doubts about our ability to make real change in that way, but I don't know what the alternative is either.
Well, do you think so? What about catastrophic disclosure? Do you think that what do you make of this idea that there is a faction breaking free from the legacy program that is trying to bring forth disclosure by any means?
I'd say that like I love that idea, but I haven't seen any evidence for it. Which is not to disparage or denigrate people like David Grush who have come forward and, risked their careers and all of that to say what they can say. But people like David Grush and Lou Elizondo have told us what has been cleared in their DOPSR, right? And anything beyond that, not only can they not tell us, but in certain situations, they would be required to lie to us, right? Like that's how classification programs work. Like that's not even me saying they're liars or that it's nefarious. That's how these things work. That's how they keep us safe. That's how they keep like Russia and China from knowing things that could be very dangerous to the American public. And so, but that's just the reality of the situation. And, all of these whistleblowers and people who are stepping forward, once again, they're only whistleblowing on what has already been approved by the DoD for them to say. And in basically all cases, they have continued to work for the Department of Defense. So like to what, this kind of like the idea that they're whistleblowing by any means necessary and that they also still work for Space Force kind of stretches credulity. It just doesn't, even who's the new one that came out? What's her name? Sarah Gam, is that right? But I mean, she works for the Department of Energy. Yeah, and she seems like a very
by itself, sorry to interrupt, but don't you think that by itself means that that is a form of disclosure, right? If they're still employed by the system and they're being cleared to talk about a lot. I mean, even in Lou's book, he talked about setting up a trap for UAPs and like bringing all of these nuclear assets together and getting them to attract a UAP and then finding a way to like spring the trap. I thought when I was reading that, I'm like, these are internal plans that he's sharing. That's pretty astonishing. What's your take on that? I mean, if they are in official capacity, sort of letting some of this information out, is that not some form of disclosure?
I mean, it absolutely could be. So there's kind of like, I feel like in this field, you really have to keep sort of like several possibilities open in your mind, right? I think that the most charitable and hopeful read that I could give on the situation is, if we look back at the talk that Carl Nell gave at Seoul last year. And, there was that famous slide that's been posted all over the place now with, the stages of disclosure. But like, long story short, the moral of the story is that at the time, I was sitting there at Seoul and being like, oh, so we're like 4 to 5 years into a like 20-year disclosure cycle, and that it's being controlled, and that they're doing that for very particular reasons because, in particular, they're worried about, like, they're not going to do anything that's going to risk. If they don't know what the outcome is going to be and there's any risk at all, they're very likely to not do it. They are worried about catastrophic disclosure, at least according to Carl Nell, and they're trying to move it forward. And so if that's what's happening, then like people like, I think that it's probably safe to assume that people like Lou Elizondo and David Grush are in some way a part of that effort, right? That they're giving us pieces of information a little bit at the time to acclimatize us to whatever it is that they're moving towards, whatever level that disclosure is going to be. I have a hard time believing that the end of that process is transparency. Like, I think that maybe it's an acknowledgement of non-human intelligence, which would be great. Like maybe it's an acknowledgement of some of this, but like the idea that then they're going to be like, all right, we've arrived and now we're going to tell you everything. Like these things are state secrets for a reason. They're not, we're not going to, so it's like a continuum. I think that's the most charitable read on the situation. I think that there's darker reads as well, to be honest. I think that in some ways it could be controlling the conversation around like leading the conversation in a very specific direction so that like more meaningful disclosure, if they were worried about that happening, if they're like, all right, well, it's going to happen one way or another, so we need to lead people in this other direction. I tend to be a more optimistic person, and I tend to be hopeful that, that first option is what we're looking at. So I think it's complicated.
I really like your perspective on this because at the same time, you are very clear-minded and clear-eyed about what is actually going on vis-a-vis the strangeness. And you're also, you have a healthy skepticism about how the government is involved in this and what exactly their end game is. And I think that is probably the best place to be for most people. And so I'm curious, what is your darker read? Can you give me a little bit of, can you tease that out a little bit? What is the darker version of this?
I mean, it's all very complex, right? Like I said, I keep all of these for each scenario and each person. I have like 3 or 4 different things that I think might be true, but then I also have to acknowledge there's all kinds of stuff I don't know. And so like none of those could be right. Okay. So I get to a place where it gets really muddy. What I can say in terms of like kind of where I find an anchor is in how the intelligence community just like works in general, right? So we're in this place where, for reasons that make a ton of sense, right? But basically all, for being real, of the information that we're getting about these technology and these programs and potentially these entities is coming to us through members of the intelligence community in some capacity or another, right? They either work for the Department of the Defense, they're part of the intelligence community, former or current. I kind of don't believe in former members of the intelligence community.
It's definitely the elephant in the room, isn't it? Like, it's weird. I'm so glad you mentioned that because it doesn't seem like a lot of people do.
Yeah, they're like, well, they don't work there anymore. I'm like, they don't let you. It's like the Hotel California, man. You can check out, but you can never leave.
Yeah, you never leave the mob.
Yeah, exactly. Once you're in, you're in. And here's the thing is that, okay, for these like top secret programs, they often have a budget that can be like 6 to 7 times the budget of the actual thing that they're trying to keep secret just for security, right? And security involves all kinds of things. And I think we need to understand that counterintelligence is a huge part of that. You know, I don't have anything against Lou Elizondo. One thing that he says that I do take issue with is that he's like, well, we don't run ops on our own people. You know, that was something we did a long time ago and we got in trouble for that and we don't do that anymore and no one would ever.
They all say that.
And I'm just like, please. And the reason I know that that's a lie, besides just all of the evidence, is that if you're going to run counterintelligence, right, which is Lou Elizondo's expertise, so he knows this, is that if you're going to keep a secret from, say, Russia, right, like we have this tech, we got to keep it secret from Russia, we got to keep it secret from China, you have to set up these kind of like elaborate stories and smoke screens and all of this, which, you know, to keep them from figuring out what this is. If anybody gets close to it, you've got to divert them to some other thing. But you can't, in today's connected world, you can't do that and to just Russia, right? Like, it's not like we can have a town hall and get 350 million Americans together and then they're going to tell us the truth. But then they're like, pinky promise, you're not going to tell Russia and China. Like, that's not how it works. So if they're running these counterintelligence operations, even from a completely like altruistic, patriotic place to keep the United States safe, they're still running ops on their own people. Like, to say that they're not is ludicrous. And so I would assume that most of the information that we're getting through these channels is like, some of it's true, some of it's not, and that it's like strategically mixed together to kind of like call a bunch of things into question. It's kind of makes it hard to know exactly what's going on. And like I said, I don't think that has to be nefarious. It could literally be just to keep us safe. And I know that there are people in the world who do very awful things or scary things or things that I wouldn't want to do, but it's really easy for me to like get on my moral high horse about that because like I sleep easy at night knowing that I'm safe, right? And so like I'm not trying to come down on those people, but I do think that it's naive to think that that's not happening. But there's an even deeper layer to it, which is that even the people who are running counter intel, right, and that sort of thing, those people also probably don't have the truth, and they are probably also getting disinfoed. There's a really crazy scene I think it's in Mirage Men. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's really fantastic. Where like Richard Doty is telling the whole story about how he disinfoed Linda Moulton Howe, and he's like, I brought her into this office in this Air Force base, and I gave her this folder or whatever, and they recount the whole story. And then like later on, he explains how he knows that all this stuff is true, and he's like, well, they brought me to this Air Force base, and they sat me down in a chair, and they gave me this folder.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And it's just like, sir, think it through. You know?
Yeah.
And somebody who's running counter, and like it's all need to know. And somebody who's running the smoke screen for the project does not need to know what the project actually is. And it would make a lot of sense that you would disinfo those people too. Like, I don't think that people necessarily understand how deep this goes, how complicated it is, and that even people who have the very, very, very best of intentions could be sowing disinfo without even knowing it.
I see your point. Yeah, that is actually a very terrifying scenario that you describe. It seems like within the cover up, depending on whose story you believe or who you listen to, no one actually knows what anyone else is doing. And it's like this situation where we're talking about the biggest event of ever, and some group is in control and no one knows who they are, what they know, what they've promised, what they've done, what agreements have been made. It is terrifying. It's almost too big to even grok. Like, you can't even wrap your mind around on the whole thing. What do you make of, do you think that another party outside of the United States government may make a move or may do something before our government can react and spill the beans in some way? Some people have suggested that this might be coming, and that might be part of what's motivating all of this forward. Do you think that that's a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a possibility. The world being as unstable as it is right now geopolitically, I think that if somebody felt like they had some kind of an advantage that they could take, especially if it's somewhere, Russia or China in particular, that they'd take it. I think that it make a lot of sense to do that. I think that we're kind of teetering on the brink of nuclear war, kind of at all times. Just try not to think about that.
Yeah.
But I also think that the people involved, not to say that there couldn't, that it could never happen. I think it absolutely could happen. But I also think that, all of this kind of like saber rattling that's going on, they know that if anyone uses a nuke, it's over. Like, for everyone. It's the chain of events that would set off would be so catastrophic. It's not like the world would end in a few months or a few years. Like, the world would end in an afternoon. And they know that. And like,
there's no
nobody
coming back. There's like 6 months later, we're all back, like COVID. We're all, it's over forever.
Right. And so if somebody had like a Trump card, not to make it political, I don't mean like that kind of Trump card, not to make it political, but if somebody had something that could kind of trump all of that, I think that at some point, like, why wouldn't you use it? You know what I mean? Like, because if there was a way to bring the other powers to heel without the nuclear option, somebody's gonna use it. And so, and there's all kinds of rumors about that. And here's the thing: like, I'm a UFO podcaster. I'm constantly getting disinfoed, and I have all kinds of firewalls up, and I just, whatever. I do my best to make sure that I let people know these are rumors, and I have no proof of them whatsoever. But I have heard rumors that China's further ahead than we are, and that part of the disclosure stuff that's going on is because we're losing some of the brightest minds of our generation to like string theory and that sort of thing. But if they had any inkling, like what Lockheed had in their garage, that like they'd go work there instead, and that we desperately need those people because like we're falling behind in some way, and there's some threat of that. I've also heard that like no country has made meaningful strides. They've had this stuff that they've been trying to reverse engineer it for decades, and that like no one's gotten anywhere with it. Like, and I think the truth could be anywhere in that spectrum, but it's certainly, if you want to game it out, I think that's definitely on the table.
What would you say about something like the Catholic Church, who's got a history thousands of years long with probably deeper archives than even the United States has? Could they make an announcement or something, a statement?
Potentially, if they thought it would benefit them. I don't know that the Catholic Church wants to tip their card on the kind of money and power that they have. I think that most people have this kind of like idea of the Catholic Church, that it's kind of this like calcified, like old, stodgy institution that's just like hanging on for dear life. But like, over 1 billion people on this planet are Catholics, and they turn in those money envelopes every single week in church. And, they've had treasure and wealth that they've been sitting on for millennia. And, I would not be at all surprised if the Vatican has its own intelligence agencies. Something I found, this is not me saying that please don't hear this, that the Vatican is behind like Havana syndrome. But what I do find really interesting is that in some of the statements from our government about Havana syndrome, they have said that like one of the suspects could be a non-state intelligence agency, which, like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, are we talking about, so we have to assume that there are factions that have a lot of money and power and influence that are basically invisible, that are able to put together something on the order of our intelligence apparatus. So, like, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's very complicated.
Sure. Well, look at a guy, even a person in the public eye like Elon, who has more satellites personally than any government. Like, he maintains a satellite network of thousands and thousands of satellites. He has his own space program. You have Jeff Bezos, who has his own space program. These are private billionaire individuals who control wealth and resources on par with some national economies. And that's just the people we know about. So it doesn't take much imagination to think that there are other groups that we don't know about that have even more, for sure.
No, I completely agree. And I think that, I don't know if this will be the case, but something I find really interesting is that, like, you have somebody like Peter Thiel, who owns what's it called, Planeteer? I always forget how to pronounce it. Palantir, yes. So he's got this, like, massive surveillance company. He also spends a ton of money on media, particularly in this space, actually. So he's like, you can see him kind of like grabbing these various levers of power, right? Because billionaires are able to do that. Like, they're able to operate on the level that, like, previously only a country was really able to operate, or
he
like you said.
Peter personally shut down Gawker. I don't know if you remember that case a few years ago, but yeah, he was the one who funded that lawsuit until they went out of business.
Yes, exactly. And so I do wonder if, like, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift where billionaires kind of are taking power in a certain way. Elon Musk is now going to be, like, a part of Donald Trump's administration. Like, you see this kind of shift where these individual people have the ability to kind of shape our day-to-day lives in a way that, like, is completely unprecedented.
That's a really interesting point you just brought up, because you have a guy like Elon, who is already running multiple different companies and a government agency. Well, not yet, but ostensibly will be running this efficiency group within the government. And through SpaceX also has billions of dollars of defense contracts with the government. And it seems like such a conflict of interest from any direction that you look at it. I'd be curious to see if Elon would take a look at the Pentagon's budget and maybe find some inefficiencies there that can be eliminated.
Right. I think that's actually something to be perhaps hopeful about. On the one hand, I think it's, like you said, it's a conflict of interest. Whatever you think about Elon Musk, I think it's pretty safe to assume that some of the deregulation that he recommends, or, the institutions that I wouldn't be surprised if some of those end up really benefiting his companies, right? Like, that would make sense to me. On the other hand, what we are dealing with is something that has been, at least with the, UFO phenomenon, what we were talking about in terms of disclosure, is, like, we've been dealing with decades and decades and decades of kind of, like, this deep state apparatus that has gone completely, untouched. And if they deregulate enough and they shake up enough within that, like, because the bureaucracy in our country is enormous. There's like 2 million people who work in the government as we think of it. And then there's another, I forget the number. No, it's 1 million people who work in the government. And there's like long story short, there's like twice as many people who work in, like, the bureaucracy that's, like, not technically our government, but they're contractors and they're this and they're that. And if we're able, and that's how they're able to, like, silo all this information and keep things from people. And so, like, if enough of that gets shaken up, I could see that, like, maybe something shakes loose and we're able to make some progress with disclosure. But if that happens, I think it'll be more of an accident than anything else, but it could happen.
How does Wall Street fit into this whole thing for you? Or does it?
Well, I think it absolutely fits into this. I think that it's going to be about the tech, obviously, right? Like, it's going to be, obviously there's going to be a lot of people that are going to want this to come out so that they can make money off of it. That's just how it goes. And the best way to make money off of most of the stuff is probably weapons, warfare, that sort of thing. But that's always been a very lucrative business. I think the real problem is that probably certain defense contractors have been given things that other companies weren't given. They were given unfair advantages. They basically have a monopoly on this stuff. I think that there's a lot of people who are eager to get this stuff out into the public sector, but it's kind of a tug of war because in doing so, for them to do that, they'd have to kind of like let out some of the illegal things that happened to cover this stuff up. And then it's like, who's responsible for that? And like, who pays for that? And what does that legal battle even look like? I mean, it would be really, really destabilizing. And I think that at a time where we're like teetering on the brink of World War III on any given day, I think that it's really unlikely. I think they're going to do everything that they can to keep that from happening. So like, while there is this desire, I think, for this tech to come out, I can't imagine that they would let that happen and have suddenly our major defense contractors have all of these major lawsuits and all of this at a time when it could be going to war at any moment. Like, I don't see that happening.
One of the most interesting presentations that anybody has given so far, to me anyway, to my mind, is Carl Nell speaking to the SALT conference. And, which was all Wall Street guys, venture capital people, investors, the whole investor class. Do you, for someone of his background and stature, worked with these defense contractors for so many years and held such a high position, for him to come straight out and say there is zero doubt to that group, it seems like a pretty clear signal that there is pressure from inside the investor class to start getting their hands on some of this technology. Do you read it that way, or do you think that he was just doing a paid gig and he just was there and he said what he said?
I think of all of the kind of characters in this pantheon of disclosure, that Carl Nell is the most methodical and careful, and I don't think he does anything accidentally. And so I think that was absolutely intentional. It's hard for me to know exactly what his intentions are, but I think it's probably what you're saying, that it's exerting people with that kind of money, the investor class, like you're talking about, like they have a sway within the government and within not just Congress, but all branches of government in a way that your everyday people are never going to have. And so, if that was something that was going to be useful in this kind of like more long-term push towards a controlled disclosure, like I think that would make a lot of sense. He could have another reason, but I don't think Carl Nell is not a loose cannon. I think he's extremely careful.
So that brings up an interesting question then, because if someone like that, this is something always been my thing, is like when you see people at this level making moves like that publicly, it's not something you do if you aren't preparing for something. Like there's something motivating that. There's some factor is at play that's making them go publicly and make these statements. Otherwise, they would just seem ridiculous. What do you think, in your view, is the likelihood that something else is coming? So there's some other event that is pushing all of this forward that is outside of anyone's control. It doesn't matter who's president. On the certain day, at a certain time, we're all going to know what's going on one way or the other, and we just had better be ready for it. It seems like that's what he was driving at in that Soul presentation. Is that your view, or what's your take on it?
I mean, I think that's certainly a possibility. I think another thing, speaking of things that we that seem very obvious, but that we just don't talk about in this field for some reason, is that almost certainly, like, if what we're dealing with here, and I tend to believe that that's a pretty big part of it, if what we're dealing with here is some kind of an advanced non-human intelligence presence on this planet, or close enough to be a problem for us, then the state of play with regard to all of this is being largely defined by them. It's either being allowed or disallowed by them. And so I tend to think that if we have catastrophic disclosure, that probably the most likely source would be them, because, they're to have the kind of technology that they have, and not just the technology, like people really skate over all the high strangeness and all of that, but seemingly the ability to hack our perception, to have, certain people see things that other people don't, like, or something happens and everybody who saw it except for one person forgets about it. Like, these are like things that are really, really common in the experience or literature. Somebody who has that kind of power, like, none of this is happening without their consent. And so, I think that there could potentially be that people, that they either are afraid that something like that could happen and they want to get out ahead of it because they're afraid of things like, losing authority and that sort of, like, all kinds of things, or, the economy collapsing, or, whatever could potentially come from something like that, and they want to get out ahead of it. Maybe they're aware of something that is going to happen and they want to get out ahead of it. It's so hard to tell, because I mean, like, the example that I'll use is, I recently, over the last year, because I've rewatched kind of everything as I was working on my docuseries, and I went back and watched Lou Elizondo's show, Unidentified. And especially in that first season, it really feels like they're driving toward something. Like that there was something major that was going to come. Like this was all very calculated, and it felt like it had this momentum. And then in season 2, it was like a little bit muddy, and then it just kind of like disappeared, and then Lou Elizondo like goes off the map, right? Like what happened there? Like I don't know that we're ever going to totally know the answer to what happened there, but I think that there's enough different powers in the background kind of like struggling for the remote on this situation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That like I don't know that we can say with certainty. Maybe there's something that like certain people want to happen, other people don't want to happen. I don't know. Like it's all very complicated.
It really does feel that way. Like it feels like there are multiple groups at play here, and they're not all, they don't share the same objective. It feels like there's a degree of chaos happening right now, and what we're seeing is sort of like the shadow on the wall of that chaos playing itself out. We can't quite make out what's happening, but we know it's not organized in the way that we thought it was. There's something else happening.
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely appears that way. I'm curious if you followed any of the statements that, while we're talking about high profile people, any of the statements that Danny Sheehan has made recently, because he's made some humdingers, if I can use that word. Did you see his Yale presentation?
Actually. No, I didn't. Things have been so crazy. I'm behind.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot with this. He made a presentation at Yale, and it's on the New Paradigm Institute YouTube page, and I won't get into all the stuff that he talked about, but one key thing that he did say was that, and he really hammered this home, and I found it really peculiar that he was driving this point so hard, but he said, we have to prepare our people. These NHI are preparing to intervene. These were his words, in our society in a way that we are not prepared for. And we have to, and he even said, we need all of the departments at this university. We need the university system to start preparing people, because when this happens, it could be enormously disruptive unless we onboard everybody. And we have to start that process like yesterday, more or less. And I just wonder, when you hear people say things like that, it's so huge, and it's just such a massive statement that it makes one wonder what is in store, and maybe does this conversation, I guess it breaks down into two things, right? We have the disclosure conversation, which seems to be held within the boundaries of government disclosing data to us that they've got, right? But then there's this other scenario that could play out. Contact, a mass showing event, something where we have experiencers, as you mentioned, all over the world who are having one-on-one encounters and experiences all the time. If we put government to the side for a minute, and I want to come to Cosmosis and talk about that in just a second, but sort of to set that up, you talk a lot about individual experiencers and the things that they have experienced and how that's affected them. Where does the experiencer fit into this discussion, and how has that changed over the last 10, 20, 30 years? It seems like we're moving into a new phase of this conversation.
I mean, I hope that we are. I hope that we're moving into a new phase of the conversation. I know just from I am newer to this field, and it took me a while to even come to terms with the fact that I was an experiencer, but I'm, lucky enough to know a lot of people and a lot of experiencers who've been dealing with this for decades, some of them for their whole lives. And I know that like within that subset of people, that there's a lot of frustration that in many ways disclosure and all of this actually seems to be like moving, they feel, many of them, further and further away from a more honest conversation about what this actually is. The experience and the experiencer have been so decentral, like so decentered in all of this. Like most people don't even want to talk about it because they feel like it's in some way going to, disrupt disclosure. It's going to scare people off or whatever. But I mean, when you take the experience out of it, I think that there's almost nothing left, right? Like we're left grasping at straws. We're left listening to the intelligence community for better or worse. And, we don't have, there's no firm ground for us to stand on. We don't have this, we hear about this tech all the time, right? But we don't have it. But what we do have is this store of memories of, I would argue, likely millions upon millions of people who have had some sort of an encounter with a non-human intelligence, entities, crafts, all of these things. And I think that we're actually moving further and further away from that. I don't hear it being discussed. Like, the high strangeness of it isn't really being discussed. We're talking about, the maneuverability of craft, but I haven't heard, any of these big names or the people in disclosure talking about things like I was mentioning before, like the hacking of perception, the loss of time, like the way that it impacts people on a deeper psychological level, the way that these things affect us then on also a cultural level. Like, there's all of these things that we have that we could be using to make more sense of what's happening. And it's all been just like completely sidelined and marginalized. And so, like, I would love to hear more of that being talked about, but it's very rare, and it doesn't make it into the conversation very often.
Do you think that that's on purpose, or is that just because it's too slippery to really get your mind around, because every experience is so subjective?
I think it's both. I think that in a lot of ways, the kind of manufactured campaign to create stigma around this decades and decades ago, when you create something like a stigma like that in the culture, it's kind of like you can set it and forget it. Like, it becomes self-reinforcing. And so, I don't think that it's something that we end up enforcing it on each other. There doesn't necessarily have to be any outside force. And I also think that, like, just psychologically, humans reject things that destabilize them. Like, we need to have kind of an agreement between all of us about what is true about our world, more or less. We can have different opinions on certain things, but like the basic nature of our reality, what it means to be human, and like what's going on here, we all kind of have to agree on that for us to have an economy. Like, that's just how humans work. And so I do think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of factors.
You've been working on this project, Cosmosis, for some time now, in addition to everything else that you do, which I don't know how you have the time to do all of this. It's superhuman. Tell me about Cosmosis. What is this project? What does it mean to you? How long have you been developing it? What can you tell us about it?
Sure. Yeah. So we've been working on it it's been in development for about 18 months. And we've spent the last year filming. Our first filming day was actually at Seoul, which was really exciting. And so, our goal with Cosmosis was we weren't seeing the kind, like, this is not to disparage anyone, but like, we weren't seeing the kind of media that we wanted to see in the field. I teamed up with Jordan Flowers. He is our CFO. He's also the CFO of the UAPDF, really smart guy who kind of helped us create the structure of our production company, Ontocalypse, because we wanted to be able to kind of like self-fund and self-release so that we had complete creative control over what we were doing. Because just, we're friends with a lot of other people in the field and documentarians who are doing this stuff. And they have a lot of trouble oftentimes selling things or getting what they want into the final product when you're working with someone else. Like, if the more in this field that you can kind of self-fund, the better. But I'm a creative. I don't know how to do that. So that's what Jordan does. And so I wrote it, and J. Christopher King directed. And we really wanted to create something that started with the assumption that UFOs are real and then take it from there. And we didn't want to just kind of present a series of like, well, that's weird, and this over here is weird, and look at this thing, this is weird. We wanted to be able to give people frameworks that they can use to try to understand these things. I think that there's stuff that people in the community are going to find, really valuable in this, and things that like really haven't been talked about before, and voices that haven't been heard before, and stories that haven't been heard before, which I think is really important, because in a lot of other projects, it's kind of like the same 15 people over and over again, just in different configurations. And we brought like new people who have never been in something like this before, including experiencers. And we wanted to create something. So like things that I'm really proud of about it are that, like, for the first time, I haven't seen it in any other project like this. We're actually going deep on each of the hypotheses about like what this could possibly be. We're giving people actual frameworks like the 6-layer model and that sort of thing to try to understand all of this. And we're centering people. We're centering the experiencers and trying to help people understand that like this is more than just headlines. This is more than just sort of like palace intrigue in DC. that that this is something that's going on all the time with people from all different walks of life. And we tried to actually represent people from all different walks of life so that hopefully people out there who are struggling with these things on their own and don't feel like they have a place in the UFO conversation can realize that they do have a place in this conversation. And so we're just trying to we wanted to create our own sandbox where we could have a different kind of conversation than the one that's being dominated by the disclosure narrative.
I think that's so important to put the focus back on the experience, the human experience, because it is so profound and so life-changing. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like it just in general terms, for people who don't know or who have not had their own personal experience or who wouldn't call themselves an experiencer, what kinds of things happen to an individual when they have a contact experience? And how does that change or affect their personality, their worldview? You know, when the person, they go in one end and they come out almost a completely different person, but there's a process there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There's we talk to a lot of experiencers, but there's kind of two stories that we tell throughout the series of two different experiencers that I think are coming from like two very different places that I think helps us kind of get a better handle on it by looking at it from these two very different lenses. So the first one is like a really classic military case, a gentleman by the name of Mario Woods, who had a really crazy encounter back in 1977. And his story has actually been told before on screen, but never the whole story, which is what happens all the time, is that like, you know, if you're going to tell this story on like a major network, they cut things out, right? Like it gets too weird. So, you know, we were the first people ever we were going to tell Mario's. He's told it in other places on podcasts and that sort of thing, but there's all kinds of things that usually get left out. Like for instance,
this is the story that you open the show with, right?
Yes.
He's got a phenomenal voice.
Doesn't he? He's like made for
God.
this.
Yeah.
I know, he's a dream, and he's a wonderful human on top of all that. But I mean, like the beings that he sees, those are cut out in like any other show that he's in. Nobody shows that. But then we go deeper into his story further along in the series, and we show that number one, he had other anomalous experiences and sightings in his life, which is something that I think we don't talk about enough and is often used to like discredit people, is that experiencers tend to have experiences that are more than just one modality. So it's not just like you see a UFO, maybe you also experience poltergeist activity or you have a precognitive event or that sort of thing. There's like a spectrum of anomalous things that can happen to people. And if you experience one, you're more likely to experience another. And often this is a lifelong thing for people. And so like he tells a story about a sighting actually outside of his school when he was a kid. And so we have that in there, which I think is really interesting. But we also go deeper into the fallout of him, you know, of him having that experience while he was on duty, where he saw a craft, they saw beings, and well, maybe a craft, it was a giant orb. And they saw, which is really interesting, right? With all the orbs that are being seen over, you know, Air Force bases and nuclear sites right now. He had an experience like that, and he saw one very, very close up, and he lost several hours of time. And when he came to, they were somewhere else. And in being debriefed after that, he was basically told, like, you can never talk about this to anybody ever again, you know, all that you would expect. But then people always kind of end the stories there. But that's not where this ends for people. And we brought on Dr. Ea Whiteley, who's a space and aviation psychologist who works with pilots and works with astronauts, and talk, you know, and particularly people who have had experiences or sightings of UAP, and it doesn't end there for them. Like for Mario, he went home and he started having like crazy apocalyptic dreams about nuclear war and tsunamis and all of this stuff. And he got like really fixated on the pyramids, which is something like he had never been interested in before. And now all of a sudden he's obsessed with the pyramids. And like all of this stuff is actually, it sounds crazy, but it's actually really typical. Like most people don't know that Neil Armstrong, after he came back from the moon, became this like very, very private guy, but you can find this on YouTube somewhere. He ended up joining this expedition. He agreed to do television like one more time after that. And it was to do this expedition down in Central America, to go down into this cave where somebody claimed that there was this underground library with like thousands and thousands of year old, like giant golden books that were left there by extraterrestrials. And like he went on that expedition. So like this interest in these kind of esoteric ideas that pops up for people after they have these experiences is actually really common. And that feels like a data point. Like, I don't know what that means, but the fact that we always cut that stuff out, I think it's often in the spirit of maybe trying to protect the credibility of the person who's telling the story, so you don't think that they're a crackpot. Mario Woods is so clearly not a crackpot. And I think that we need to understand like how weird it actually does get for people after they have these encounters.
Super weird. And didn't Chris Bledsoe also talk about an Egyptian connection after his sighting? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a super common occurrence. I would say even for people who have what like Diana Pasulka would call a book encounter, where like they don't actually see a UFO, but they have some sort of a, synchronicity or something where like all of this opens up to them and they realize that it's true. Like all of a sudden, a lot of people get obsessed with Egypt for some reason. Like, why is that? And I mean, I think that there's the only way we're going to figure out what's going on here is by examining these things. And like, we're not jumping to any conclusions about what they mean, but like, if we're not even willing to tell experience or stories the way that they happened and tell the parts that are most important to the experiencer about what happened, like, how are we going to make progress in understanding what this thing is? I don't think we can.
That's such a critical point. It's such a critical point because these are people who ostensibly have been inside the craft or inside a base, or these are the people where the rubber meets the road. They have the knowledge firsthand of whatever these beings are, wherever they're being taken and what's being done to them while they're there without, necessarily the filter of the government getting involved and trying to spin the story one way or the other. So it's interesting that there's not more of a focus on individual experiencers, but I guess it's just not enough data points to really correlate any one of those stories. They seem like they're so vastly different in terms of the types of beings that are encountered, the types of experiences that are reported, the types of ships. They just run the gamut of all different shapes and sizes. There's commonalities to be sure, but there's definitely a wide range of things going on. And one of the things that you talked about in Cosmosis that I thought was interesting, and you just brought it up again, are the frameworks that people use to understand what is going on. And you make the mention in the show that the frameworks that we've been using so far don't seem to be big enough almost to include everything that's going on. Can you talk about the frameworks and what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. The frameworks that we go into, we are, what are the basic, because I think a big shock for people who are coming to this subject for the first time, and we're hoping to get a lot of people who are coming to this for the first time. We wanted to create something that people in the community would love, but also that you would feel like you could, your friend, when they finally show that little bit of interest, or your family over the holidays or whatever, you can be like, here, watch this. And it'll be like a good intro, right? And so we wanted to start with the different hypotheses about what this could be, because a lot of people, I know when I came to this, I had no idea that there were things that were, that there were other possibilities about what this could possibly be besides just aliens. That was the only way it had ever been presented to me. And so we dive into, why the extraterrestrial hypothesis is not really sufficient to cover the data and why there are things about it that are kind of suspect. Not that extraterrestrials don't exist, they almost certainly do, but it's not enough to explain like the full gamut of what we're seeing. And then we dive into, other things that have other ideas, the interdimensional hypothesis, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And we even introduce new models like that which comes from Dr. James Madden, who wrote a book that was published through our company, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, talking about the idea that what we're dealing with here could be a hyperobject. And then in episode 3, we go even deeper with what is called his Uber-Umwelt hypothesis, which is a whole other conversation. But we wanted to push this as far as it could go, but also make the case that like none of these is probably quite right. Like we're dealing with something truly unknown. And the thing that's going to connect all of the dots is likely going to like force us to have to tear down major categories of knowledge that we have been relying upon for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's not just going to be like, that's where the name of our company comes from. It's not going to be just an ontological shock where like, oh, wasn't expecting that. It's going to be an ontological apocalypse, which is why we called it ontocalypse. I think that, our categories of what things are and how the world works and what the nature of our reality is going to eventually have to collapse to accommodate this kind of new reality that's peeking through.
Tease that out for me. Like, I'm just curious what different thinkers in this space imagine that process to be and maybe the outcome of it to be. Like, I have my ideas, and I know everyone's got an idea of like, if disclosure happened tomorrow and the president comes out and says something, or an open contact event took place, like some enormous shift happens, what would it look like? What do you imagine that looking like? And I guess if you could take your pick of any scenario to unfold, what would you like to see? Forgetting about like anything else we've talked about so far, just like if you could have it your way, how would this all go down?
You know, the irony of all of this is that I think that there's a part of me that actually really dreads that scenario. Like I've made my whole life about pursuing this question, but like getting some kind of an answer really quickly sounds, I mean, like if we woke up tomorrow and there's, and I look out my window and there's craft in the sky, or there's craft appearing over major cities, like what does that look like? I think if we had some sort of a confirmation like that there was something going on, I think that it would create chaos. And I know that a lot of people bristle at that idea, and they think that it's like an excuse and it's a cop out. And like, I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but I think that like we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's not going to be a mess. You know, in a lot of ways, probably the institutions that we've built, I think most people are kind of coming to a place where we realize that like there's some real rot in the foundations, and that there are some things that need to be changed and things that need to be overhauled in terms of the major institutions that kind of dictate how our lives go, from the government to the media to academia, all of that. Like we've got some major problems there. But if suddenly and catastrophically getting confirmation of not just the fact that we have been lied to, like really aggressively, systematically psyoped and lied to for decades, that the nature of our reality and the history of the 20th century, and perhaps even long before that, all the things that we believe to be true are more or less kind of a fairy tale. They're a fabrication. Like they were in some ways the idea that kind of we do live in the matrix in a certain way, and that we live in this sort of cage of ideas that's been set up for us. Like coming to grips with that would mess a lot of people up. And I know that because like I see people coming to grips with similar things, you know, all the time. And it can be dangerous. Like it can literally lead to psychosis. It can be extraordinarily destabilizing. People can become a danger to themselves and others. Like to minimize that is, I think, really naive. And then if you add on to that, this idea that there's a non-human intelligence here, that they are far more advanced than us, that they've likely been running the show for a very long time, and that a lot of our meaning-making models and potentially even our religions and that sort of thing were also kind of manufactured. On top of that, we don't run things here. Like we're not in charge. We never have been, and we have absolutely no way to defend ourselves or to control what happens next. Like, that's not a happy day for the human race, you know? Like, we could argue that it's the best thing that could happen, and that, like, at that point, we could kind of start to, like, really at least live an authentic life. But that's not a scenario that I long for. I don't know that I want to be around when that happens. I think it can be, I mean, I don't mean to be a bummer about it, but I think it's scary. And so in a lot of ways, you know, that's why I say, like, I'm really skeptical about a lot of the things that I'm hearing from people in disclosure, but I do take some comfort from the fact that, like, maybe this is a longer campaign and they do have some kind of a plan of how to acclimate to people to this over a longer period of time. As frustrating as that can be for people who are like sitting here waiting for more breadcrumbs and wanting to know what happens next, or for experiencers who really need the culture to affirm them and recognize them in some way, you know, so that it's not causing so many problems in their life. Like, it's, as much as I have empathy for all of that, I think like a long drawn out process is actually probably better.
I see your point. I can totally see your point. It definitely seems like I'm kind of that mind too, that it could be the reality of getting what you actually think you want is not going to be necessarily what we think it's going to be. And that could be very uncomfortable for people. And once that illusion of control is destroyed, there's no way to claw it back. It'll just be like, no. And it brings up all kinds of interesting cultural questions too. Like, what incentive do people have to listen to their elected government if there's something else out there that supersedes that? And what what's your incentive to get up and go to work? What's your incentive to, do anything really, until you understand the new pecking order and how it all kind of works and how we participate in that. I think that's a huge question. And it seems like it also creates this opening for people to, and I see this a lot in our own community, and I'm curious what your take is on it. There seems like almost like a instinctual reaction that some people have to almost turn this into its own religion in a way. Like you could say I've heard it argued that like the singularity is a religion for tech bros. It's like all the things you want about it's immortality, and you can live forever, and you can be 25 years old forever, and it's great, and you can have anything you want, and you can live in this virtual reality world. But ultimately they're describing a religious framework. They're just mapping technology onto it. Is the UFO community doing the same thing with UFOs? Putting this phenomenon up on such a pedestal that it's so astonishing and it's so powerful and it's so unbelievable that we just have no choice but to take the knee in its presence.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. And I think that I can understand why people take issue with that, and why people both don't want it to happen or don't want to acknowledge that it's happening. But I think that like this is the story of humanity. I think that like this is the response that we have when we have some sort of contact with the beyond, with the numinous, with something beyond ourselves. Like, I'll use an example. I went to Bright Pat, and I was kind of just like driving around outside, but with somebody who had worked there for decades as a psychiatrist, actually, and who had talked to a lot of people whose lives were getting very messed up by the things that they saw and weren't able to talk about. At least that was what he said, right? And I'm looking at Wright-Patterson, and I'm realizing that like it's very kind of like low profile. There's not many buildings on that entire campus that are more than like 2 or 3 stories tall. It's all very kind of low and squat, and it's hangars, and it's close to the ground. And I was commenting on that, and he goes, "Oh, but it goes way deep, deep, deep underground. Like there's way more below ground at Wright-Patterson than there is above ground." And it made me think about the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And the thing about Wright-Patterson is that obviously it's named Wright-Patterson after, the Wright brothers, or at least part of its namesake. That was where the Wright airfield was. That was where, the earliest kind of human flight, or attempts at human flight, at least, were taking place. And then it becomes this place where allegedly the Roswell materials were taken. And then it becomes, eventually like the NGO and Space Force and all of this other stuff, like now have a presence there. And so there's almost like this lineage at Wright Pat that's on this ground. It's almost like hallowed ground in terms of humanity's efforts to go to the stars. And at the Temple Mount, you have something very similar, where there's all this stuff that's been built on and built on and built on. There's like the Holy of Holies. There's all this stuff underground where we don't know where it is. And there's only like a few people who are allowed to know even what's there, right?
Secret knowledge, relics. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's the same behavior. And I think that like, there's a lot of talk about cults, and there should be, because like that's dangerous. Cults can be very dangerous, and involvement with this topic can cause people to form or get involved in cults and be exploited in really horrible ways. But like the part that's tricky about that is that all religions, but we have this connotation around what cult means, but like all religions start as a cult. All religions start as a group of people who have experienced something that they believe is entirely otherworldly, that has utterly transformed them, and they're just on fire for this thing. And then they like go out into the world and they tell other people. And like over hundreds and then thousands of years, that gets calcified into like this institutionalized religion that in some ways like is almost meant to protect us from ourselves. Like it becomes this intermediary between us and whatever this thing is. And I think it's a very human thing. I think we are spiritual animals, for better or worse. And I think that this is just how we behave. And so I think when people don't want to talk about that, it's like, well, it might not be convenient, but I think it's extraordinarily difficult to argue that that's not what's going on here, at least to some degree.
I see your point. Do you think, I feel like a lot of what we're dealing with here it is so complicated. There, on the one hand, you have the relationship between the civilian world and the military, which is complicated to say the least. But especially in America in particular, we have a tendency to deify or put on a pedestal the military and the military experience, and to just assume that the military is always like, they've got your best interest at heart. Don't worry. These are our men and women in uniform, and they are out there doing the hard work that no one else will do. And it's if we just trust them. But that's not history tells a completely different story. And I think, do you get the sense that we're in a situation now where you've got a group of people in the military industrial complex who are just interfering with the process of us understanding the truth so much that they are creating a lot of the problems, like the psychological stress that you talked about, a lot of the, like, gaslighting. Is it real? Is it not? Getting people completely wound up over it just because of all the misdirection and misinformation and shenanigans that have gone on for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely happening. I think that's absolutely happening. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately is that I've found increasingly that to understand what's going on in ufology and with disclosure and all of that you need to understand mind control, that you need to understand how that works. And there are a lot of people, Lou Elizondo just talked about it in his book, about his involvement in torture at Guantanamo. There are other members of
which, by the way, I just want to jump in there. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead.
Just to the point that I was just making, he talks about torture, but he kind of just rolls over it, like really casually. He's like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. Dude, no, you shouldn't have tortured you messed with somebody. Like, what? No, you should not have done that. But that doesn't, but I feel like that there's this sense of like, but he's one of the good guys, so it's all right if he did it.
Yeah. I am not as willing to just brush that under the rug. That is a data point that I feel like people were just like, well, you don't know what you would have done in his shoes. And, like I said before, I recognize that there are people who do things like that to keep me safe, right? And it's really easy for me to get on my high horse. But at the same time, like the way there was just like no further questions from the community about that was really strange to me. And like as a side note, by complete chance at that time when like maybe about, this is probably like 2017 or 2018, I knew someone who had been, like for a very brief period of time, I didn't know him very well, but who had been a lawyer who was representing one of these people who had been in Guantanamo without any kind of trial or charges or anything for a very long time. And that where a lot of this torture stuff was coming out. And that guy's life was basically like ruined by that. Like he was like a very promising, it seemed like a very optimistic and guy who got into this stuff because he believed in human rights and all of that. And I had no details and I did not know him well, but like this was a dude who was like not doing okay. And it was because of what he knew. And I just, like I said, like I'm not here to cast stones, because I don't understand the complexities of that situation on any level. But I do think it's weird that people were so willing to just sort of like roll on past that and like not talk about it ever again.
And for people who may be too young to remember that period after 9/11 with Guantanamo Bay and everything that happened there, this is a situation where it's very complicated and there's a lot of different angles to this story. But to a large degree, legislation was passed that made it possible to just black bag people. They could just roll up in a van, grab you, throw you in it, and disappear you to a prison that was an offsite. They had all kinds of crazy things going on. They would set up prisons in other countries that weren't on American soil. So technically it wasn't like, there were loopholes to get through. It's so complicated. And I feel like this national security excuse is just like, it's their ace card. They can pull it out. They can play it anytime they want. They go, well, it's just to keep you safe. It's just it's a security thing. If you only knew what I knew, you'd understand. And it's just that we can never beat that. There's no way past that obstacle.
Right. And I don't know. I don't know what I would do if I was in those shoes. I can say though that I wouldn't be in those shoes. Like I'll say that, I don't. Anyways, it's not for me to judge, but it is odd to me that like, and it seemed like there was almost like a group of flying monkeys going around on Twitter, like shouting down anybody who wanted to even like mention that maybe we should discuss that further. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, maybe we should talk about that offline sometime. I'm curious. Let's step out of that conversation. Let's pivot there. It seems like now more than ever before, maybe it's because we're so interconnected. Maybe it's because the community has coalesced around this topic in a very bipartisan way, which I think is hugely encouraging, especially in these times. It seems like that there is an enormous push and a groundswell of support for somehow, I don't think anyone really knows how yet, just crowdsourcing this thing until we crack it ourselves as a community. What is the role of the civilian in this larger discussion? I know New Paradigm Institute has they just today or yesterday put out a statement about creating a working group at the United Nations that would address this topic in a formal way. Is there a way that we can sidestep the American security apparatus in the traditional sense and just move forward, try to establish some form of citizen contact, collect data on our own and get to some answers without waiting for someone to give them to us?
Absolutely. And that's a big part of the argument that we make in Cosmosis. All this stuff that I've been talking about with, the complications of disclosure and getting information from the intelligence community, like at a certain point, it's hard to justify continuing down that path. Right? Like that doesn't seem to be the answer for us. Like the information that we're going to get through those channels is always going to be muddy. It's always going to be vulnerable to disinformation. So it's also can be dangerous at certain levels. Like if you get too close to this thing, people really do have their lives destroyed. Using Jeremy Corbell as an example, if you listen to just what he's saying in the tenor of these last few episodes of Weaponized, like my dude seems genuinely stressed. These things, what I mean?
He does.
He's having a hard time. And I like Jeremy Corbell, for the record. And I think that's tough. And so at a certain point, it's well, why do it? Let's just do stuff on our own. Let's form truly, civilian groups and organizations and DIY this thing. Let's make it punk rock. We made our show and we're going to be releasing it. It comes out December 30th on Apple TV. And then we're waiting for release dates on Amazon Prime. And then we're going to release it through a few other channels. Internationally, people can get it. But on Apple and Amazon, it's going to be in the US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia. And we did that with a team of our production company has 3 members, and we raised 100, which is a fraction of the budget of one episode of Ancient Aliens. And we're releasing this thing on our own. These are things that are possible now. And I think that I'd love to see 1 million people come behind us and do the exact same thing. You know what I mean? I want that to happen because I think that that's the way forward. The only way we're going to move forward is kind of together. We have to get it's fun and it's interesting. And I think you can even argue that it's important, no matter how futile it is, doing the right thing and trying to get our government to do the right thing. I don't think that that's ever a complete waste of time or energy. And I don't want people to hear that. That's not what I mean. But I do think that we have to save ufology from disclosure. I think that that's critically important.
Tell me more. Describe this. This is I've never heard it put that way. Please explain.
I think that ufology has been subsumed by disclosure. And that, like I said, the information that we're getting, the big names in the field, all of this, it's coming through the military intelligence apparatus. That's where it's coming from. And no matter how well-intentioned those people are, there's no way that information isn't hopefully sullied. Suddenly nobody wants to talk about anything that's not coming through these certain channels who are the people who, by the way, have been lying to us from the very beginning. And so, and we're not talking about experiencers. In some ways, back in the 90s, when they were openly, John Mack and Bud Hopkins and all of these people who were doing work with abductees and contactees and that sort of thing. In some ways, we were further ahead in kind of understanding this thing back then. In a lot of ways, disclosure has caused us to regress in terms of our understanding of the phenomenon itself. And so, disclosure, I agree that it should move forward. I'm not against disclosure and I support it when and however I can, but I think we have to save ufology from that. We can't allow the disclosure narrative to be ufology. We need to put it in a whole other sandbox, and that inquiry needs to happen outside of that paradigm, or else and it needs to be coming from the experiencers and the contactees themselves, because that is as imperfect as that is, that is a much better source of information for us to be pulling from to try to understand what's going on here than the way that kind of we're doing things in the disclosure sandbox.
That's such a great point, that it's almost like by corralling ufology into the discussion about disclosure, they can almost kill it with bureaucratic infighting and make sure it just dies in Congress. It never really gets anywhere. It's just, we maybe learn a little bit, but we never actually get the full picture. And meanwhile, we're so focused on that we're not actually talking to the guy who's been on board the craft, or the woman who's been inside of an HI facility, or who's met something face to face and had a one-on-one experience. That's a great point. I've never heard it put that way.
Well, and going back to the idea of like mind control and how that works, like the point of all of that stuff is profound demoralization. And so like if you wanted to control a group of people, like profoundly demoralizing them is a great way to do that. And like, I don't know that that's what's going on here. Like I said, like I keep a million options open, but you know, just today, my phone was blowing up before this interview because the NDAA came out and none of the UAP Disclosure Act language made it for like the second year in a row, right? And so, you know, we had this moment back with like right after the Grush hearing where it felt like, all right, we're there, we've done it. Like it's right around the corner. It's right around the corner. And like since 2017, I think that there have been like several waves of people who have like become interested in this, clocked in, made their little account on UFO Twitter, you know, followed all the stuff. And then at some point we're just like, screw this, I'm out of here. You know what I mean? And the tone of the text messages that I was getting today were just a lot of people being just like, you know, I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. And like the enthusiasm that there was around that legislation when it was first introduced last year has just already it's the tone is very different. And I feel like even the people who are still rah-rahing it, you know, a lot of these people I know behind the scenes, and you know, they're rah-rahing it because it's like they're a good soldier. You know what I mean? Like they're doing what they don't want people to give up, but everyone's discouraged.
That's where the powers that be have an asymmetric advantage over the rest of us, right? They control all the information and we have none of it. And whatever we do think we have, we don't know how much of it is legit, how much of it is fan fiction, as you said. And so that's the battle they would rather fight because they can't lose. And it's almost like, to your point, setting that aside and just focusing on individual experiences and talking about the phenomenon and engaging with that as a civilian group is your better play in terms of just return on your energy invested. It just seems it's so exhausting to get caught up in that conversation because it's almost, there's always a tomorrow, there's always a next whistleblower, there's a new leaker who's just around the corner that's going to blow the lid off the whole thing. I love Ross Coulthart, but I just heard him the other day. He was like, what did he say? He was like, I don't know, something like buckle up because the next couple of weeks are going to blow your mind.
But all of us are just like, we've heard this.
I'm like,
I also love Ross. He's an angel of a man, but all of us are tired. Are we not?
Yeah, it feels that way, right? Like what changes the paradigm for people if civilians can get together? And as you said, you DIY'd this. I think since the first conversation you and I had together, you've written a book, you've produced a series for Apple TV, you've got a highly respected podcast in this space, you're a journalist, you've covered this whole topic. Like you've done a tremendous amount of work in just the short time that I've known you. As a small group, if enough people, as you said, follow behind you and take that lead, what are you hopeful for? What could we achieve? What do you think is possible?
I mean, I think so much is possible. I think one thing I'll say that we need desperately, and somebody that you might even want to talk to sometime, is my business partner, Jordan Flowers, because Jordan is a really, really smart guy. Went to Princeton and Columbia Business School, has a consulting background. He started successful businesses. And like, there is a real lack in this community of just business and financial acumen. The cluster of personality traits that makes one kind of walk away from a normal life and do this instead is not often good at the numbers. They're not often good at like Jay and I without Jordan would be nothing. Like we could not do what we're doing without Jordan crunching the numbers and pushing us on the numbers and keeping everything in line and making sure that we're paying our taxes and handling all the investor paperwork and like all the things that I don't know how to do and I probably wouldn't do if I did. Like I need a Jordan, right? And we need a lot more Jordans in the field. We need people who have that kind of business acumen who can come in and enable this work. Because if we can't build businesses that are that are successful, that if you can't have investors come into this space, by the way, most of our investors, the majority of our investors, actually, the vast majority of our investors have no connection to the UFO community at all. These are like traditional investors who have invested in something with a traditional investing structure. And that's what people respond to. And so if we want to get outside of this paradigm that we're in, we need people like Jordan coming in. And so this is the call out to all of you, like, you are needed, and from there, I think the sky's really the limit. But I think that, like, taking a more direct approach with it, we have this kind of culture, especially like on Reddit and UFO Twitter, where people are just kind of like waiting for the next breadcrumb from whatever name or whatever. And then we're going to just like, like we just suck it all up. And then we're going to talk about it. But like, we're just consuming this story, but like, there's something real going on here. And if you've never had an experience of this, like, there are ways to get there. Like, there's, there are contact protocols that people have success with, and you can find people who can teach you that. Even something as simple as remote viewing. Like, I learned how to remote view with a book. Like, there's a book, I have it on my shelf. I tried it, and I'm not going to be recruited as a psychic spy anytime soon. But like, I was able to get enough results with that like, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had real proof that like the nature of our reality is not what we think it is, and that consciousness can do more than we thought. And I think that like, that's really where the next frontier of all of this is. And in some ways, I think the secrecy around UFOs is covering up this deeper secret that they're more afraid of us figuring out, which is human potential and what we're capable of. I think that I would love to see more people focusing on that, as opposed to kind of like the tech and the palace intrigue.
That's a really interesting statement. I think Ross has alluded to something similar recently in recent statements he's made, that it has a lot more to do with human potential than we have maybe been led to believe. And the focus on nuts and bolts is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not even close to the most important piece.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about this a lot lately, and there's a guy, Daniel Elizondo, no relation to Lou Elizondo, who's a brilliant researcher. A lot of people are saying that like he's the next Richard Dolan, and he's like the Richard Dolan of our generation, and I 1000% concur. I do not think that's overselling him in the slightest. And he and this other guy called the Hermetic Penetrator, he doesn't use his real name, but that's a great name, co-wrote this thing called Loose Threads. And you can find it on their Medium, and they have like a free download. Like, you can just get this for free. And they went back and just all with like archives and people's journals and declassified stuff. Like, this is all information that's out there, but nobody's doing this kind of digging. They really pieced together kind of the early history of ufology, and it involves names that people still know today. It involves people like Hal Puthoff, John Alexander, and like these people. And these people have been involved with each other and with the question of all of this from the very, very beginning. But like, the way a lot of these people met in the first place was that they were involved in the Stargate project, in the remote viewing program. And so like these people who are seemingly like obsessed with UFOs, and you think of them in the sense of ufology, when you look at their actual history and who they associate with and what they've been involved in, the thing that they're actually interested in is like human potential, near-death experiences, that sort of thing. And
Isn't
like, I think that's always been, yeah.
Isn't that rabbit hole so bizarre? It's like, you're so right. With Hal Puthoff is a great example. He is somebody who's at the beginning of this whole thing, at least going back to Stanford Research Institute in the 70s with the Stargate program. You just reminded me of one of my favorite books, which is Ingo Swann's Penetration.
Yes.
No relation to Hermetic Penetrator.
Right.
But if you take Hal Puthoff as a serious individual, and you accept that this is a person who knows what he is talking about, and then you follow his experience back and his resume back, and you go back to SRI and the work he did with Russell Targ on Stargate, and then you read Ingo and you look at what he says in his book, the jump that you have to make is so enormous. You go from like, this is real, Hal Puthoff is real, he's legit, they were really working on this program was legitimately producing real results. Now here's the book the guy wrote, and he's saying there's a base on the moon. There is like, there are hybrids walking among us that look just like people, that have telepathic powers. There's like this enormous jump. And it's almost too big to fit inside your head. But the implications are astonishing.
They are astonishing, like no doubt. And I think in some ways, not in some ways, I'm sure that turns a lot of people off. For anyone who's hearing this and is turned off by that, what I would say is that, like, I 100% believe in remote viewing. I've done it myself and had incredible hits that I can't possibly explain. So, like, those things are real. I love Ingo Swann, obsessed, and I think he was a very legitimate guy, and I think that he was telling the truth. I still maintain a lot of skepticism around things like bases on the moon. Like, maybe, that could be the case, but I think that, like, the more I've come to understand about, and this is why you actually have to talk to experiencers and listen to them, and we have to do this over decades, is that, like, the phenomenon disinfos people also, right? Like, people who clearly have a demonstrable capacity for these, like, really strange psi abilities, like remote viewing and that sort of thing. And they can be so right that, like, there's the famous example, like, Jimmy Carter got basically, like, laughed out of office for saying that they used remote viewers to find this, like, downed plane in Africa. But, like, that happened, and they have that ability. But that doesn't mean that every single bit of information that they get through those channels is accurate. And so a lot of times, people who have that ability very clearly, they'll have, like, some real success that can't really be explained any other way, will then also have stuff come through that's, like, turns out to be completely false. And so I do think that it's more complicated. It's complicated. Like, there aren't easy answers. But like I said, if people want to know if remote viewing is real, like, literally just pick up a book and, like, give it a try. I've never met anybody who's tried it who hasn't been able to be at least somewhat successful.
And those documents are available on the CIA's website. You can actually go there and read them. That's what's so bizarre. It's like, it's all right there. It's right out in front. And if you want, you can just read it and get caught up, and there it is. Isn't that weird?
Well, and I think they just kind of, they don't think we're actually going to believe it, And there's an incredible amount of, I always joke that, like, the best place to hide information is in a book. Like, nobody's going to, nobody's going to read it. It's like the 10th page of Google results. Like, hypothetically someone could, but no one actually goes there. Like, like, in this field, so many people give lip service to people like Keel and Valet and all of that. But then, and you hear what they're actually saying and what their takes are, their most basic takes are on what's going on right now. And it's clear that, like, they either that they haven't really read it or they didn't really internalize it, but there's a huge, enormous, vast amounts of information about all of these topics, about the people involved. I mean, like, the forbidden science books out there, like, those are literally just, like, volumes of Jacques Vallée's, like, journals. Like, that's available, but nobody reads them. And, like, it's no wonder we're lost.
It's interesting too, because it's like, that's, I think, what I'm driving at when I ask the question of what would it look like to you? Like, what does that big moment look like to you? Because I often wonder for myself, what would it even look like if we had all the answers that we're looking for? Like, what does that even turn into a year later? Does Jake Paul try to fight an alien on YouTube or so? Like, how would we screw it up as a goofy, stupid species that's just so preoccupied with, like, dumb shit? And I just wonder if we're ready. You often hear we're not ready for it. And maybe we're not. I keep thinking there's this Star Trek future maybe waiting for us, but maybe we have a few generations left to go before we're ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think inevitably we're going to turn it into a spectacle. I posted recently about this book. I don't know if I even had it. I used to have it right here a minute ago, but there's a book by a guy named Guy Debord, and it's called Society of the Spectacle. And to me, it's probably the most impactful book that I've read in understanding not just the phenomenon, but everything. And he kind of argues that, and he was writing this back in the 60s, I believe. Like, this is way before TikTok and Instagram and all of that, and a million streaming channels. But he was talking about how, like, the natural evolution of a technological society is a society that is mitigated by images. That, like, all of our information and the things that we think and all of that come to us through images, and that we are, like, extremely susceptible to believing, like, seeing is believing, right? Just as an example, like, there were a lot of people and philosophers and scientists who were talking about in the early 20th century about, like, what it was going to do to the human race to be able to see a picture of the Earth from outside of the Earth. And when you think about the fact that, like, up until very recently, in terms of human history, like we had never seen that before. It gives you an idea of kind of like the power of images and what images are able to do to us and what they do to our minds. And like we have this society that is completely mitigated by images. We're consuming images, we're consuming stories, and like increasingly not living them. Like our relationships are increasingly mitigated by images and that sort of thing, and not by like actual interaction with a human being in a shared space.
That's a great point too. It's almost like you can think about it when I travel sometimes, and if you're flying over, wherever and you look down at just how much space there is, and it's like you are not going to see 99.9% of the earth ever but there's stuff happening all over. There could be aliens, there could be bases, there could be, who knows, it's just everywhere. And so the one-to-one experience of actually being there and seeing it is so rare. And we all do try to make do as best we can with the images that we're given. Even now, like with the drone thing, we're just all looking at the same videos and pictures going, what is this?
Yeah, exactly. And so like, I guess what I would argue for is like the best thing for us to do, like to be clear, I am utilizing that reality and that system to try to like get to people, right? Like you're doing the same thing. And like to try to, open people's minds up to these things. Like that's what we're doing with Cosmosis. But what I hope happens is that people take it offline. I hope that they take it into their actual lives. I hope that they take it out of theory and into practice. Like try some of these things. Go out into the field, actually talk to experiencers and listen to their stories. Like, I think that we need to, because the spectacle is going to spectacle. Like, it's just going to do its thing. That's going to happen, just like it's happening with this drone flap. This is how all of it is going to be kind of like consumed by our culture. The reality of it isn't on a screen. The reality of it is outside. It's in your life.
What's your hope for Cosmosis? How many episodes are you planning for? Do you know yet? Like, how far along in that process are you?
Well, we're finished and it'll be out on the 30th. And there's 3 episodes in this first season, but we're already planning a season 2, where we'll be doing even more and going even further with it. So people can stay tuned for that. But as soon as this thing comes out, we're hitting the ground running in 2025 and going to do another season.
You said Apple TV. You mentioned Amazon. Can you go through once more the platforms that this is going to be available on?
Yeah, so it'll be available first on Apple TV on December 30th. Amazon is taking a little longer. Like we're kind of at the mercy of the streamers. But when we get a date for that, I'll definitely post it and let people know. But it will be available there eventually. I'm just not sure exactly when, in the next couple months. Probably. And it'll be available in the US, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia. And for our other friends in other countries, we're also looking at some other options, something like YouTube or something like that people can use to also access it if you're in another country.
And just out of curiosity, as you develop the series and move forward, if someone has had an experience and they feel that it's something that you should know about, or they want to get into contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that and to keep up to date with what you've got going?
Yeah. You can always, I post my email everywhere. It's kelly@uforabbithole.com. I will say that because I post it everywhere, I have more emails than I can possibly get to. I definitely read them all, but if I don't get back to you, please don't take it personally. I would never get anything else done. I treasure, though, every single story that I get. And, if it's not a fit, it's not because your story isn't fascinating and important. There's just so many, many, many stories out there. But Kelly@uforabbithole.com. You can also reach out to me on Twitter. I've got one on Blue Sky now because all the kids were doing it.
How's Blue Sky? Is it good?
I feel like I'm going to get roasted on Blue Sky for this, but I feel like every post on Blue Sky is people like gaslighting each other that Blue Sky is somehow better, and I have not. Or that it's nicer. I don't think it's nicer. I think it's people being mean in the same direction. And so it feels nicer to them, but I don't particularly, I still find it to be abrasive.
Kelly, you are the hardest working person in ufology. There's no question in my mind. I don't know how you find the time or how you do it, but you are doing yeoman's work. It is amazing to watch your group and all the things that you've been able to put together. I'm so excited to see the rest of the series. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and chat with me today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Clint. This is always so fun to have a conversation with you. And yeah, thanks for having me back.